As before, if you need an explanation of what this is, please go back and look at Chapter 1. Chapter 3. Isabella passed the placement exam with a spectacular score, to no one's surprise, though to the distinct chagrin of one James Mathers, who had been deeply offended to discover Isabella was applying to the same department he was. They were both accepted to the School of Engineering, and Isabella hardly even minded. He was already making a name for himself as an exceptionally rude and self-centered freshman, and she had spent so much of her youth and childhood around the university that a few of the professors seemed surprised that she had not already taken their classes. No amount of ill favor from one student would damage her reputation at large. She was annoyed, however, when she discovered that James Mathers had already taken a room in the dormitory so that he could stay the summer and begin auditing classes. To make it even worse, he was auditing the exact same classes she was. Within a month, she was seeing more of him than she was of her fiancé. And matters just became worse when the new semester started, and they began as official full-time students. They were in the same classes, had the same assignments, and spent roughly the same hours in the library. Her only consolation was that from the very beginning she was doing better in her classes than he was. For the first couple of semesters, they both would be forced to take a large number of basic general courses, basic language, literature, art, history, science, and math courses, as well as their introductory engineering courses. As the years progressed, they would spend less time in the less related fields and more time studying math, science, and engineering. Both Isabella and her rival had opted to take as many of their out-of-discipline requirements in their first term as they could, which meant they were both taking 8 courses, and Isabella had put in her application to be a research assistant on the School of Engineering's big project the first day of the semester. She doubted she would get it. It was not a position for a freshman, but she had to try. The engineering school was building a submersible ship, a boat that could travel underwater. They were not just talking about windows into the underwater world, like the constantly swirling waves around the university. They were talking about being able to actually explore the waters of the vast oceans. It was the most brilliant idea that Isabella had ever heard of. Not just the wonder and amazement of being able to build a boat that was entirely airtight, but building something that could explore places that no living person had ever seen. It made her almost giddy, and she would kick herself if she managed to miss out on the opportunity of being involved. Most of the plans had been sketched out across the summer, but they still needed people working on things like which sealants had proven sturdiest at which depths, simple motors, gathering data from tests, and they would need a large workforce in actually putting the thing together. Isabella was more than willing to make time in her already hectic schedule to do the simple tasks necessary to make the machine work, as long as it got her involved in what she thought might be the most important project in First Island University's history. And of course, we are hoping that this will provide a powerful research tool for all our counterparts in the School of Natural Science and History. Just think of how many questions will be answered when we no longer have to guess about the strange fish that are occasionally caught in the deep-sea fishing nets, but can actually see them swimming around in their own waters. And I'm sure Professor Reid and his colleagues have considered the possibilities of how much we will be able to learn from visiting the sunken cities. I believe Professor Reid himself once predicted that Mare's Own contains enough historical evidence and important relics to fill 25 First Island museums and libraries. Professor Alberts nodded towards Isabella's father, sitting in the front row. Isabella was sitting with Mark halfway up the large lecture hall. The university-wide symposium on the submersible project was crowded, and only those directly involved in the project and the heads of the various schools had been granted seats in the front rows. Mark leaned over and whispered to her, "Is Professor Alberts saying they are going to mount an expedition to Mars?" Isabella shushed him. The professor was still speaking. "Current estimated scheduling has our first short-duration test run in 9 months' time, and assuming that goes well, we are planning on a long-duration test next summer. We plan a 5-day voyage, taking place mostly above the surface, with a support ship above the surface, and 3 major deep dives. The first dive will be around 300 feet off the coast of the third island barrier reef. Assuming a successful dive, the second will be to 600 feet in the deepest section of the channel between the island of Nons and Mares. The third will be to an estimated depth of around 400 feet into the heart of the sunken city of Mares." The room erupted into none-too-quiet murmuring. Mark was squeezing Isabella's hand hard enough that it hurt. She smiled over at him. She had heard rumors through the engineering department that the professors were considering it. The entire project had just begun and was already over budget. They needed the support of the other departments, and honestly Professor Alberts might have suggested it even had they not. He was well known for his fascination with the technologies that had been lost within the past 500 years. Modern engineers and artisans couldn't even come close to recreating some of the relics and structures left over from the pre-sinkings days. More than a dozen cities and whole islands had sunken over the years, but Mears was one of the biggest and the oldest known site. If there was something to find, it would be there. Professor Alberts cleared his throat. Now, this is all reliant on the first test being successful, but we are hoping on compiling a small team of representatives from the natural science and history departments to accompany the crew on the summer venture. He spoke over the growing murmuring. We will not even begin considering who to include until after the first test, and when we do, we will be relying on the heads of the two schools to offer recommendations. Now to move on to the designs. Isabella grinned. Smart of Professor Alberts to start with the visions of exploring undersea worlds and rediscovering lost cities. What would have usually been a slow technical talk had suddenly become much more interesting to the parts of the audience with little to no basic knowledge of engineering. The audience was listening very carefully to a description of the inner workings of the planned submersible, some even making quick sketches of the diagrams and blueprints tacked up on the blackboards. Isabella was only half listening. She had already seen the plans and heard the explanations. Half of the systems had already been used in one or more of the basic engineering classes as a teaching aid, and the others she had gone out of her way to study. She had even convinced a few of the upper-level students to share some of their still confidential work. The only surprise for her tonight was the confirmation of the summer venture. Or maybe not the only surprise. Isabella glanced around at the audience, her eyes sliding over James Mathers, looking annoyed that he hadn't known everything before it was announced, when she felt a jolt of surprise. In the back of the room, among the dozens who had arrived too late to find a seat, right next to the door, a tall, slender figure was leaning against the wall. The blind man, Ward. Isabella hadn't thought about him in months. She had been so busy with starting school that everything else had been forgotten. She had never even thought to ask the security guards about him, nor had she noticed him lingering in the halls, but she hadn't been noticing any of the museum beggars at all. But there he was, clearly listening as intently as any of the students or professors. He had a right to be there. The symposiums were open to the public and free to attend, but other than a couple of bored-looking reporters, there was absolutely no one without a tie to the school in the room. It had nothing to do with Isabella. She forced her gaze forward, back to Professor Alberts, pointing out specific mechanisms on the diagram pinned to the board. But what was the blind man doing here? Throughout the rest of the presentation, she kept glancing back over her shoulder at the beggar, but he never looked bored. Long after the technical discussion had lost the interest of basically everyone not in or teaching an engineering class, he was still listening intently, with that strangely serious frown on his face. For reasons that she could not understand, Isabella felt herself bristling. What right did he have to disapprove of what might end up being the greatest scientific tool of the century? The end of the presentation took her by surprise, but she made a big show of standing and offering her most enthusiastic applause with the rest of the audience. Even if large portions of the audience really could not care less about how it would be done, everyone was excited about the notion of finally being able to explore the oceans that made up so much of their world. Or almost everyone. Professor Alberts had made sure it was leaked ahead of time what the engineering project would be, specifically so that the security guards could wean out the overly superstitious before the presentation began. Everyone knew that seawater was bad luck, that you shouldn't touch it, drink it, and definitely never swim in it if at all possible. Even some of the other professors had balked when Alberts had first suggested the project to the deans. Isabella's father had reported the scene to her as almost a dozen old men all stood, spun in a circle, and spat over their shoulder as soon as Alberts had suggested taking a ship below the waves. Of course, the professors, even the most superstitious, were innately logical men, and Alberts had been able to quickly talk them past their worries simply by explaining that no passengers would be touching the water. Isabella could only imagine what kind of silliness the security guards had kept from reaching the presentation this afternoon. Even with all the work they had done to weed out the doomsday preachers, As soon as Alberts had mentioned the word submersible, half the audience had gasped like he had said a dirty word. But even the most superstitious had quickly grown excited about the potential gains from such a project. Isabella wished she had a reason to push through the crowd down to Professor Alberts like the reporters and many of the professors already were doing. But she did not have any right to monopolize his time at the moment. She sighed. She could always discuss the symposium with him in class the next morning. Mark smiled over at her. "We could go make ourselves available to your father. He is sure to have a thing or two to say to Professor Alberts." In fact, Professor Reid had already pushed his way to the 3 core members of the project. Professor Alberts and his 2 favored senior students were already surrounded by a group of curious and ambitious. Isabella smiled back. "You go." As Professor Reid's research assistant, Mark had a good chance of being part of any cross-discipline research or study. Isabella was just a freshman. "Don't be silly, abuse your father's privilege. No one will blame you." Isabella grinned back at him and was almost ready to let him drag her into the press, but then she saw James Mathers pushing his way through the crowd. She'd been raised much better than him. She would not abuse her father's place in order to bother her professors. She smiled at Mark one last time, squeezed his arm, and slipped through the crowds towards the door. Almost everyone in or involved in the university had squeezed themselves into the lecture hall, and even though it was a large room, it was an extremely tight fit. As soon as she was free from the overwhelming amount of people, Isabella slowed. More people were flowing out of the lecture hall behind her, and trying to avoid the press of people, Isabella crossed to the windows on the far side of the museum hall. The sun had set during the symposium, but the moon had yet to rise. It was extremely dark outside, but she could still just barely make out the flash of the waves a few floors below her. To think she might be one of the engineers exploring under those waves in just a few months. Because she was going to be part of this project. She would find a way. "Miss Reid." Professor Albert's voice pulled her around. He was just pushing his way through the lecture hall door, followed what seemed to be most of his audience. He ignored them and strode pointedly towards her. Many took his not-so-subtle signals and stepped back, waiting their turn, but a few continued on after him, crowding around Professor Alberts and Isabella. Much to her displeasure, James Mathers was one of them. Professor Alberts ignored them. "Miss Reid, I did want to speak to you before I sent out tomorrow's memo." Isabella tried not to frown. She had no idea what memorandum he was talking about. Professor Alberts was well known around the university for assuming the people around him knew, if not everything that he did, at least most of the simple facts that he did. "Yes, Professor?" "You applied for the research assistant position on the submersible project." It was not a question, but Isabella nodded anyway. "Even though the job description made it clear that we were looking for at least a second-year student." Isabella nodded again, more warily. "We did not even tell the first-year students about the position because I did not think there would be anyone who stood a chance of being up to the job without at least a full year's worth of study." James Mather was glaring at her. He probably hadn't known there was an open position, but Isabella had pestered Benjamin Daniels, one of the senior students, until he had shown her the listing. "Yes, sir. I couldn't see any harm in applying. The worst that could happen would be my being turned down, and then I could try again the next time you were looking for someone new." She finished speaking and held her breath. He could so easily take her words as disrespectful, though she meant them honestly. Mathers was staring at her open-mouthed, seemingly shocked at her gall, but Isabella dismissed him. He would have done the exact same thing if he had known about the research assistant position. After a moment of watching her, Professor Alberts nodded. "All right." "All right?" "Yes. I will take you on as a research assistant." Isabella felt her eyes widen and her breath catch in shock and excitement, and obviously Alberts could see it as well, because he continued before she could thank him. "It will be, of course, conditional on you keeping up with your primary classwork, and it will be probationary. If I even begin to suspect that you cannot handle the job, I will find a replacement." He waited for Isabella to nod, and when she did enthusiastically, he smiled at her. "I will see you bright and early, 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, and be prepared for a good bit of physical work, young lady." He nodded sharply and turned to storm off, still ignoring the small army of colleagues, students, and reporters hoping for a word, a question, or a quote. Only a couple of the followers glanced back at Isabella. Mathers took the moment to give her one more glare, snapped out one word, "nepotism," and jogged off to follow the professor, probably hoping to somehow convince the man to offer him the same opportunity. Isabella did not let it bother her. She knew that Professor Alberts would never hire someone who he did not trust to be able to do the work, even if the person was related to one of his colleagues. Finally, Isabella found herself relatively alone. The hall had emptied, with most of the people either following Professor Alberts or clearing out ahead of the crowd. Only a few people remained, strolling slowly up the museum hall. Looking around one last time to ensure that she was unobserved, Isabella spun in a happy circle, giggling. She had done it! She was part of the project, and she was determined to stay. As a few more stragglers wandered out of the lecture hall, she forced herself to stop giggling. Everything was working out exactly as she had dreamed. She should go tell Mark. He was probably so absorbed in talking with her father that he hadn't even noticed how much of the room had cleared out. Isabel turned toward the hall and stopped in her tracks. The blind man was there, leaning beside the door, his face turned towards her, almost as if he was staring at her. He wasn't, but Isabel was sure he had been listening to the conversation. She took a step towards the door and stopped at the sharp sound of her heels against the marble. The beggar tilted his head to one side, listening. She had not been the only girl in the symposium, but she was one of the few, and her boots made a distinctive sound. Did he know it was her? Did he remember her at all? Why would he even care? Miss Reid? With a start, Isabella realized how unfair she was being. His only way of knowing where or who she was through sound, and she was using that to hide from him. She nodded, and immediately realizing her mistake, added, yes. The expression that crossed his face was not quite a smile. Congratulations. He looked sad, and something in that melancholy called out to Isabella. She wanted to reach out and touch his shoulder, or brush aside the hair that had come loose from his blindfold and fallen into his face. Isabella blushed. What was she doing thinking such things about someone other than her fiancé? Not that she had any confusion about her feelings. What she felt for the blind man was curiosity and a good bit of pity, but that could easily be misinterpreted by outside observers. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Thank you, sir. Now, if you will excuse me. He nodded slowly, but Isabella did not move to leave. He looked as though he wanted to say something more, but as the moment stretched, it became clear that whatever it was, he wasn't going to say it. Isabella shrugged and walked past him. There were only a dozen or so people left in the lecture hall, and Mark was easy to spot. His tall, lean frame stood out amongst the stooped older men still crowding around the diagrams posted on the front wall. Isabella's father was in the center of the group, arguing loudly. Isabella grinned. Even from across the room, she knew what they were arguing about. Over the last few months, her father's research had progressed rapidly. While they still could not read large portions of the three-text stone, Professor Reid had found even more links between the Non's dialect and certain segments of the stone. Combined with the certain connections Mark had been able to find with certain parts of the mirror's tablet, Professor Reid was well on his way to proving that the three-text stone did speak about some kind of treaty, and possibly even the conflict leading up to it. Both her father and her fiancé agreed that all they really needed was a few more primary sources. Most of the other historians still believe that they were both just jumping to unwarranted conclusions, but at least now they had enough evidence that their colleagues were willing to openly discuss the theories. The men were arguing over what exactly this venture to mirror should focus on, as if there was absolutely no chance the submersible could fail to live up to specifications. They heard there was a possibility of going, and now assumed the trip was guaranteed. Buried within the discussion was an argument of who exactly the history department should recommend to be taken on the submersible. If they were looking for more parts of the three-text stone puzzle, there was no question that they should send Mark. But if the venture focused more on the layout of the city itself and the city's final moments, one of the other senior students would be far better choice. Each of the different professors had their own special project that a venture to mirrors could push along, and all of them had their own arguments as to why their studies should take precedence. If Isabella did not know Professor Alberts, she would have been concerned that he had opened up a bigger can of worms with his announcement than he could handle. But Professor Alberts was just as senior as Professor Reid, and could deal with even this small army of self-important obsessed academics. For her part, Isabella was already annoyed on her team's behalf. This project was about getting a working underwater craft up and running, and all the challenge that would be faced along the way. Any extra researching possibility was just that. Extra. Of course, it was hardly her place to tell any of them that. Isabella waited for someone in the group to acknowledge her existence. After a moment, Mark glanced up, and straight back down at the diagram. A moment later, he looked back up at her, clearly finally registering that she was there. He gave her a half-hearted smile. Isabella could tell he didn't want to leave the discussion. At the moment, one of the younger professors was suggesting an addition to Albert's designs to allow someone inside the submersible to reach out and pick up artifacts off the ocean floor. It was absurd, the very idea of a trap door in a submersible. Isabella's annoyance must have shown on her face, because Mark stopped making sad eyes at her and slipped out of the group. "Oh, Izzy, I'm sorry. I tried to follow you straight out, but there were too many people. Then I got distracted by Professor Fortinbras's suggestion that we go to the sunken city of Andres instead of Mares, and I just got carried away." "I'm not mad at you, Mark. I told you it was fine." "I didn't mean— Mark!" Isabella snapped impatiently, and Mark caught his breath. Isabella was not one to interrupt. "Mark, I wanted to tell you." She took a deep breath. "I'm on the project." His reaction was everything she'd been hoping for. All dignity forgotten, he wrapped his arms around her shoulder and squeezed her tightly enough to pick her straight up off the floor. As soon as her feet touched down again, she was bouncing on the toes of her boots. "I start tomorrow morning." He wrapped his arms around her shoulder and walked her up towards the door. "That's wonderful, Izzy!" He knew how important this project was to her, and he was beaming at her as they passed through the door to the now empty museum hall. Even empty, the hall seemed to bring Mark back to himself, and his hand dropped off her shoulder to lightly hold her hand. Isabella was still annoyed at his unwillingness to show anything like affection in public. Decorum was one thing, but he carried it almost too far. But at least Mark was grinning mischievously at her when he suggested, "You know, we are going to see even less of each other now. With you on the engineering project and me on the history project, we will both be busy in separate parts of the university almost the entire day." Isabella smiled. "Unless Professor Albert's plans work out, then we might be spending a large amount of time in close quarters together, exploring the great and mysterious deep." Mark grinned enormously. "And mirrors." Isabella didn't bother mentioning everything that could go wrong. She could get kicked off the project before it could even get started, the submersible could sink or just not work in its first test, the project could run out of money, the venture to Mars could be deemed too dangerous or too costly, and even assuming everything else worked out, there was no promising that either of them would actually be chosen for the crew of the summer venture. Still, she found herself caught up in the excitement of the moment and just smiled at him, thinking of exploring a part of the world previously out of the realm of possibilities.